حبايب قلبي.
ازيك؟
كله تمام. ياسمين,
Hi,
how are you, Yasmin?
I'm good. It's good to see you.
You gotta pick up the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, good to see you too. You know, we were afraid that you dumped Ahmed, following the podcast.
It was close for a little while,
some alarming updates.
Yeah.
It was definitely a rough time for everybody involved. It's good to be back.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Field Between. My name is Ahmed.
I'm Yasmin.
And today we are joined once again by the great Hossam el-Hamalawy, who is a revolutionary, a journalist, and now he is a published author with Verso. His forthcoming book, which by the time you're listening to this will be out tomorrow. Again, that's on Verso, so make sure you go order it. It's called Counterrevolution in Egypt, Sisi's New Republic. And so welcome back to the show, Hossam. It's always good to talk to you.
Thanks, Ahmed. Thanks, Yasmin. It's always a pleasure to be on my favorite show, my most favorite podcast, to be honest.
I can't tell you how much that means to us, but alf mabruk on the book. It's really,
Allah yabarak feek. Thank you.
It's incredible. I was telling Yasmin earlier, I was just like, this really reading it, the level of detail that you go into in mapping out the history and like just kind of like the taxonomy and the different branches of the Egyptian security state really kind of reminded me of reading like Lenin's imperialism and the fact that like...
This is how you know Ahmed really loves you. This is the highest praise Ahmed could possibly give.
And that like, it's just, you're looking at, this imperialism, occupation, but like doing it in such a detailed, exacting way and kind of producing like a theory of occupation and like by just looking at the facts, very material analysis of Egypt's security state. So it was like, really, really great for me as someone who is interested, obviously, for personal reasons in Egypt and what's happening there, but is far away from it. And I feel like I can't get a good source or sense of what's going on because, no one's really looking at it in that way. So thank you for producing this. It's incredible.
I'm really happy it resonated with you. And I hope also non-Egyptian readers will find it useful.
Oh, absolutely.
But regarding the level of detail, although the book is essentially based on my doctoral dissertation, which I did here in Berlin from 2018 till 2023, but in so many ways, it's the product of 2 decades of journalism, research, and activism, where I was always interested in the enemy. As an activist who joined the movement in the late 1990s, we were always on the receiving end of state violence. And by default, that aroused my interest in understanding who are these guys. In Egypt, in especially working class areas or in the countryside, when the police comes in, people say el-Hukuma get, the government has come. They regard the police as the government. That's their only interaction, with the government. And in so many ways, like dealing with the government in Egypt or dealing with the state in Egypt and the police, you're just dealing with these faceless institutions where, they are repressing you. And I was interested in knowing who's doing what when it comes to the repression. What's this perverse division of labor looks like? Which administrations, which departments, how are these guys recruited? How much are they paid? How do they make a living? How they get promoted? So then I had this book, which is the product of these 2 decades, basically, of research.
Yeah, and when we say like the level of detail is exquisite. Like, I truly mean it, and we'll certainly get into it. I want to go back to what you said about it being relevant to not just Egyptians in diaspora or Egyptians wherever they are, but also to everyone really who is observing what's going on, whether they live in a state that is under internal occupation or not. But yeah, I think the exercise of having collected this information, studying your enemy, understanding their motivations and where they're dysfunctional and where they are effective, certainly not only resonated with me as someone who's interested in Egypt, but as someone who is observing what's happening in the US. And like I said, there are just like so many parallels. Maybe we'll call some of them out, but I think they'll be self-evident as we move on. So your book starts out kind of detailing the rise of the security state and kind of starts to describe it as forming and developing under Nasser. So, going through like a coup-proofing strategy. I think one thing that you mentioned in the book is that there was like a coup attempt every like 6 months or so. So it sounds like a real time to maybe, that provides enough incentive. But like, can you talk about how it developed under Nasser, who was doing the coups, and why so many attempts?
Sure. In case your listeners are not familiar with Egyptian modern history, in 1952 we had a coup by an eclectic group of nationalist army officers. They dubbed themselves as the Free Officers, and they were led by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser at the time, who went on to become Egypt's leader for 18 years. And he was a very important figure in Global South politics. Being army officers who just reached power by a military coup, their immediate concerns was simply a counter coup. At a time where across the global south, military coups were very fashionable at the time. This doesn't have to do much with political culture or the fact that global south people, they love military coups, but in the post-colonial states, in the global south at the time, the middle classes, the indigenous middle classes, they saw the army as a vehicle for modernization, for professionalism, for the ability to make sweeping changes in their countries that will qualify them to catch up with the West, or to catch up with the modern industrial countries who once colonialized them. So the Free Officers basically opted for a bunch of tactics that were not unique to Egypt, but it was also fashionable in other countries. And the main one was counterbalancing. I mean by counterbalancing here is fragmenting your security apparatus. So you had the military, the police, and the newly founded General Intelligence Service, the GIS, or our Mukhabarat, as we call it. And the three would have very close mandate. They would have overlapping mandates. They had very little channels for coordination or the exchange of information. They were always in a state of competition for resources and for a greater share in the ruling coalition. And in this way, when everyone is busy fighting one another or competing with one another, the head of the state would be the only one with the bird's eye view to monitor the situation. And that's when you have your dominant perceived threat as one of a military coup. And the competition between those agents of coercion shaped Egyptian politics for decades, all the way up till 2011. And I probably need to clarify something, that when I say that the dominant perceived threat of Egyptian rulers, whether it was Nasser, Sadat, or Mubarak was the threat of military coup. This does not mean that they have ignored or they ignored other threats. If you're an autocrat and you want to stay for quite some time on the throne, you have to shield yourself from all sorts of threats. So that would include, of course, the threat of popular unrest, the threat of foreign invasions, and what have you. But there is always one dominant perceived threat. And according to that dominant perceived threat, you organize your security apparatus. And I'm arguing in the book that all the way up until 2011, our rulers never took us seriously as the Egyptian people. I mean, they knew that every now and then there might be a few riots here and there. There might be some instability here and there, but they never imagined that we have the agency to carry out a revolution or an uprising like what happened in 2011. And in so many ways, this kind of scorn, I'm arguing, is inherited from the colonial powers that once colonized Egypt. So the modern Egyptian state after 1952, in so many ways, it was a colonial state, but without colonizers. But then when the 2011 revolution happened, they were shocked. And they were in a state of disbelief that the mob, who are us, the Egyptians, could actually carry out a national uprising that will not only depose the head of the state, but is threatening the foundations of the regime itself. And that's when the dominant perceived threat started to change into the threat of popular unrest. And this is what shaped, or what has been shaping, the Second Republic, as Sisi dubs it, since 2013.
Yeah. So going back to what you were saying about Egypt's security state kind of inheriting the formation of its former colonial occupiers, right? Like, so I think you mentioned like the roots of the Egyptian police beginning in, 19th century, where the British were, obviously repressing people, trying to control the state, embedded themselves in like multiple levels of the Egyptian state. And it was like built on a fundamental mistrust of the people. And then another group like the CSF was modeled after like France's militarized police. It seemed like we were just kind of like, yeah, like you said, looking at all these European colonial powers and just being like, oh, that looks great. Let's do some of that. Can you talk about any of like the main events leading up to, maybe under Sadat that kind of also solidified or gave impetus to the rise and formation of the state, security state specifically? And then I think you also mentioned, the different factions of it being kind of like a many-headed hydra. And yes, of course, it like attacks and terrorizes the people, but because they have all these overlapping mandates, there's quite a bit of dysfunction within it. And like what happens when you have such a big body and you have all these like different characters who are running it with overlapping and maybe sometimes contradictory mandates?
Sure, Ahmed. If you check the Egyptian state official narrative, they always portray the Egyptian state as eternal, as an extension of the ancient Egyptians who existed 7,000 years ago. And, our current modern state is the product of this. And, in so many ways, if you look at other countries, they always claim some old ancient roots and
Completely.
Who are the Ottomans? Who are the British?
Right. I mean, even in the US, it's like, oh, somehow we were beget by the ancient Romans, which makes no sense.
Yeah.
There's always like a claim to ancient civilization.
Well, they sailed on the boat over here.
Right.
Yeah.
or lizards who came,
Yeah, yeah,
from outside space.
yeah, exactly.
But the truth is, the Egyptian state is modern and it has modern roots. Yes, I mean, even a modern state will not descend from the sky, and it will build on some of the previous ancient remains, but that does not impact how modern it is and how similar even it would be to other countries that would start industrialization and capitalist modernization around the same epoch. So again, for your listeners who might not be familiar with the history of Egypt, the modern Egyptian state was born under an Ottoman Albanian commander by the name of Mehmet Ali or Muhammad Ali.
Mhm.
This was in the 19th century. Muhammad Ali basically he created the modern Egyptian army, the modern Egyptian police, which the Brits inherited when they occupied Egypt in 1882. And they paid special attention to the police, which is something that the British were very famous for in simply all the countries that they colonized. The Brits, unlike the French, were very pragmatic. They depended on the existing local structures and just opted for controlling the top of that structure and left it to function in the best way possible in order to control the indigenous population. The white man's burden was definitely there, but
Mhm.
it wasn't as explicit as the case of the French, for example. The French were obsessed about making every colony they set foot at, part of France, when it comes to culture, when it comes to the civil administration, when it comes to the norms, when it comes to the language, and what have you. Um, the Egyptian police were a main instrument for the Brits when they were in Egypt. And if it wasn't for that police, the Brits would not have been able to control this country for 7 decades, at least. And it is that police that the free officers inherited with the 1952 coup. And the kind of restructuring that they did to that police force was minimal. And in so many ways, they militarized it even more. The Egyptian police was born from the military to start with. Under Nasser, all of the interior ministry heads or the interior ministers, they were all army officers except for one. But Nasser modernized the apparatus, helped send police delegates and cadets and leaders to countries around the world in order to learn from them, brought trainers from the rest of the world in order to train them. We had former Nazis, we had former and at the time current KGB, Stasi, the CIA initially was very close to Nasser and regarded him as someone who can confront communism and actually trained many of his officers on counter-communism. So that's the police force.
This is
You also
actually,
had,
sorry,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but this is kind of incredible because I feel like at least in diaspora Egyptians, again, who don't know the history that well, and I think he's also maybe he's like, there's a clip of him played in like a Saint Levant song, but Nasser is like seen by a lot of people as this kind of like nationalist leftist
Pan-Arabist,
hero.
yeah.
Yeah. Why is that when he was like his administration was like working with Nazis?
Not only that, but even during the first years of the Nasser presidency or the Nasser leadership, since he was more or less leading the country even before he became officially a president, um, the Egyptian new regime was not hostile to capitalism. actually there were reforms that were done in the first 2 years in order to encourage private investment, and Nasser was trying to seduce the Egyptian local industrialists to support his regime. But in so many ways, this was like a Greek tragedy, where the hero was kind of like forced into a series of situations that ended him with like choosing the state capitalist path and the pro-Soviet camp. That included, of course, the hostility of Britain and France from the beginning. That included the flight of private capital out of Egypt. That included the Suez War, the 1956 Suez War. That included so many things. So basically, Nasser was forced eventually to seek assistance from the Soviets. But initially, he was extremely anti-Soviet, extremely anti-communist. And he continued his anti-communist streak, by the way. Though he took some steps to co-opt the Egyptian communists after they dissolved their own party in the 1960s. But yeah, these details, people tend to skip them and
Yeah,
just
definitely.
talk about the post-1956 Nasser.
Interesting. Okay, so you were kind of describing again the roots of like the military police being modeled after colonialism. Um, Much like in other parts of the world, I think you specifically mentioned Egypt's CSF kind of growing its numbers through conscription of poor illiterate classes or poor illiterate conscripts, which I think inherently we see throughout your book. There are a lot of class divisions within a lot of these forces, and it's really interesting to know how they contribute to maybe revolutionary moments, turmoil, and then how the state kind of reshapes itself around that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In the late 1960s, to be exact, it was sometime in 1967. I mean, I do mention the exact dates. Um, a couple of our police leaders, they traveled to France. And over there, they got so impressed with the French CRS, which would go on to play a central role in suppressing the students and the workers' uprisings in the famous May 68. So, in so many ways, in the West, they always talk about, exporting democracy, but most of the time they do export their coercive tactics and strategies and technology. So Nasser decided to establish the Central Security Forces and modeled it along the CRS in France. This was in 1969. And actually, the date is also not a coincidence, because in 1968, Egypt witnessed the revival of street politics and the revival of the mass movement and the student movement. This movement had more or less disappeared in Egypt or got co-opted since 1954. And it got co-opted and repressed by a mixture of consent and coercion. Meaning, I mean, Nasser did not just rule with repression. There was so much legitimacy for his regime, at least up until 1967. There were populist reforms, there were social reforms that benefited sections of the Egyptian peasantry and the working class. So there was so much consent. And those who basically went off the limits were met with brute force. And these were either usually the Muslim Brotherhood or the communists. But Nasser did not really have any substantial threat from the streets. only in February 1968 and November 1968, that's when you had the rebirth of the student movement once again. The main trigger was the light sentences that were given to the Air Force leaders who were basically blamed for the 1967 catastrophic defeat in the Six-Day War with Israel, or the June War, as we call it in Egypt, with Israel. So that triggered labor protests in Helwan. Helwan is south of Cairo, and it's a hotbed for industrial militancy. So the workers in Helwan started protesting against those light sentences and considered the trial to be a sham trial, a kangaroo trial, just for a whitewash. And the police met them with live ammunition because they were not really trained or equipped to face protests by people in the streets. And then the protest spread to Ain Shams University, which is the second largest university in Egypt. And from there also to Cairo University, which is the largest. And the regime completely panicked. They didn't have the arsenal for countering mass movements in the street. I mean, they could fire at armed persons, but suddenly they are finding tens of thousands in the streets. So that's when the Central Security Forces were founded. And they were heavily militarized. They are very similar to the CRS in France and their equivalent in other Western countries. But they also depended on conscription. And usually, those in Egypt, we get conscripted at the age of 18 after we finish high school. Those who go to university get their conscription deferred, while others, they just have to serve. And usually the military picks up la crème de la crème, relatively. And then those at the bottom who would be malnourished, who would be with diseases, facing all sorts of problems, you know, I mean, in life, and they come from isolated rural villages. They get conscripted into the Central Security Forces. For example, my mother, who took part in the 1972 student rebellion against Sadat, she was a student at Ain Shams University in Abbasiyah. And she told me that one day the students actually captured a Central Security Forces conscript. He was one among them, you know, he was one of those who were like beating the living shit out of them. And then when they like asked him, why are you doing this? And they started shouting at him. He was shouting back, it's because you're Israelis. They told us you're Israelis and you're here and you want to blow up the country and do whatever, you know, blah, 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 blah.
Wow.
So, I mean, they were on that level. And by the way, this is a universal tactic, once again, not limited to Egypt. For example, I've read that in Tiananmen Square in China, the initial battalions that were sent in order to disperse the occupation in the square, they joined the students and the protesters. So the Chinese regime had to bring in units from the far end of China, from very isolated areas, in order to do the repression. During the 1997, for example, Fallahin uprising, we had like a mini farmers uprising in 1997 in Egypt. And this was part of the neoliberal reforms that Hosni Mubarak was doing in the country that would have reversed the agrarian land reform laws. So the state was put in a very awkward position. How can they mobilize those peasant conscripts against other peasants? So they brought in battalions from the south to repress the farmers in the north, and they brought battalions from the north to repress those in the south. So it is a very tricky subject, and that is always Achilles' heels in all of those security states that have mammoth military formations and security formations. They have to depend on conscription at the end of the day. And as much as this gives them power, but it also means that at certain times, the loyalty of the troops could not be trusted. And we saw this in Egypt under Sadat during the 1977 uprising. We saw this under Mubarak when the Central Security Forces went on a mutiny, a full-scale mutiny in 1986. And actually, we saw it again during the 2011 uprising.
So,
Yeah.
sorry, real quick. In 1986, specifically, you say there was like a huge revolt because conscription was going to go from 3 years to 4 years. And in that case, just to show like the mistrust, right? Like, I think you say Mubarak deployed tanks against his own people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mubarak was left with no other option but to send in the army, although he was so scared that if the army takes to the streets, it will not go back to the barracks. And again, because his dominant perceived threat was that of a military coup. You fast forward to 2011, again, Mubarak had to deploy the army after the 28th of January 2011, which is the Friday of Rage. And that's when 99 police stations were burned down in Egypt. The Central Security Forces were defeated, mainly in Cairo, but also in the other urban centers, most notably in the north, like Alexandria and elsewhere. Mubarak deployed the army, but again, he was so scared that the army might actually not go back to the barracks, which more or less that's what happened. But I argue in the book, it's not because the army was pro-revolt. The
Right.
generals wanted an end to the revolt, but it's because the loyalty of the conscripts could not be trusted.
Yeah, I think this is such a helpful sort of historical overview in setting up ultimately the stage for the main kind of thrust of the book, which is the counter-revolution that comes after Morsi is elected. So just to kind of review for the listener, we've kind of set up these sort of colonial overtones of the security state apparatus of the modern nation state of Egypt. We've talked about Nasser, we've talked about Sadat, we've talked about Mubarak, so moving chronologically through each ruler. And then we had this really big break, right, with Morsi, who is democratically elected, who is from the Muslim Brotherhood. And one thing I really appreciate about your book is that you really resist the temptation to kind of see it as a given that the military was going to turn on Morsi, that there is this kind of moment that is surprising, given the patterns we're talking about, where the military seems willing to work with Morsi. And you explained that it wasn't premeditated that there would be a coup, that it was not the result of foreign policy blunders. You make some very effective arguments going over in a lot of detail that that was not the cause. So what led the military to ultimately turn on Morsi? We had this moment of triumphant revolution of all these different factions that don't necessarily really get along with each other, uniting in a really incredible and very impressive way to overthrow the state apparatus. And how does it ultimately re-entrench itself?
Yeah, and I'll add on to that too. It wasn't inevitable that they would turn on Morsi, but like, and in some cases they worked with him, but he also was willing to work with them, right? It's like it went both ways, it seems, which did not fit like my previous understanding of like them being totally at odds.
And maybe that's kind of another question
Totally.
too, is like, did Morsi make a strategic error in acquiescing to the military as much as he did? Did that make the overthrow more inevitable?
Yeah.
No, I mean, you're making very good points, and in fact, part of the book's argument, I wanted to engage with some of the discourses that look at events in a retroactive fashion, and they see who won in the end or who benefited, and then they build a conspiratorial narrative around it that this was the game from the start. And what I was trying to argue or prove is that during revolutions, you can't really plan more than 24 hours ahead. And the fact that the army from the day Mubarak fell on the 11th of February 2011, because that's what like many narratives, both, I mean, anti-state or pro-state claim, that the army was preparing from day one, was itching from day one to take power. And actually, I was trying to prove that no, this was not the case. The army did want, in the beginning, to hand over power to a civilian president and return to the barracks as soon as possible, because their deployment in the streets was causing internal problems in the military that threatened to fracture the whole institution. I argue that the Islamists who were part of the uprising in a very contradictory also manner. For example, young Muslim Brotherhood base cadres, they were with us in Tahrir, and they were fighting to defend the square, and some of them died during the 18 days, while their leaders were sitting with Omar Suleiman, Hosni Mubarak's spy chief, trying to strike a deal and a compromise. On at least one occasion, the Muslim Brotherhood leadership tried to disperse or issued a directive to their base cadres in the square to leave, only to be actually rejected. And there was like a semi-mutiny in the organization by the youngsters. So I'm going through these details and I'm explaining those contradictions. But then I reach the central argument, which is there was a Faustian bargain between the Islamists and the military during the first 2 years of the revolution. And this Faustian bargain revolved around a very simple formula. The military told the Islamists, you end the revolution, you diffuse the militancy in the streets, and in exchange, we will allow you to be part of the ruling coalition. We'll give you a share of the cake. And actually, during the first 2 years, the two cooperated, at least on the level of leadership. I also explain how inside the Muslim Brotherhood, there was an uneasy situation. And the leadership actually was in a constant fight trying to rein in their base cadres. But their leadership denounced most of the mobilizations that happened during the first 2 years of the revolution. Their leadership was more than happy to give the military all the compromises and all the protection and all the immunity it asked for. The Muslim Brotherhood did not try to reform the old state. In fact, they sought an alliance with the old state, thinking that just by seducing the old state, that they can use the same structures for their own project. And then, there is like a volume of literature, Yasmin, on why did the coup happens. And, many strategic analysts would tell you, oh, it's over the foreign policy. It's over that incident when Morsi said this in like whatever public event. It was blah, blah, blah this, blah, blah, blah that. But I am refuting all of those arguments one by one, and I'm trying to prove that it is about the Muslim Brotherhood failure to end the revolution.
Which in a way, sorry to interrupt, is so interesting because so much analysis kind of talks about the Muslim Brotherhood as this thing that is so separate. And yet it seems like ultimately its failure was not to to go back to the same wheel. You got a quote on page 93 that really helped me kind of understand your argument. One thing that remained constant throughout the history of the Muslim Brotherhood from its inception until after the 2011 uprising is its political vacillation between confronting and compromising with the state due to its multi-class nature. So essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm understanding here is that there's kind of like a base of popular support within the Brotherhood, but then you have the Brotherhood's elite leadership that ultimately is kind of working within the confines of the state, which is a state that is run by the military.
Exactly. And you had asked me earlier about whether Morsi did a strategic error. And, looking retroactively, you can say, yeah, I mean, he did a mistake. But I swear, if time goes back, they would behave in the same manner. Because simply that is the nature of their organization. From its inception up until the revolution. It's a multi-class organization. At its base, there are farmers, urban poor, workers. The bulk of the organization are middle-class professionals, especially from the countryside, those who come from rural origins. And with the failed capitalist modernization and the failed urbanization, they are in a crisis where the old world, as they know it, has collapsed. And the new urban city, which they are integral part of, does not provide the same support, the same communal ties that they once enjoyed in the countryside. And at the top, you have industrialists, you have like big traders. I mean, Khairat Shater, for example, I mean, was someone, he's a big merchant. I mean, you can call him as part of the big bourgeoisie. And some sections of the land-owning elite. Now, having such a mammoth organization and with membership from those divergent classes, on the one hand, can give you the impression that, oh, wow, it's so big, it's so resourceful. They have so many resources, they are everywhere. But on the other hand, they can't take concrete positions. They can't have a consensus on anything that's concrete. That's why they opt for these vague general slogans like Islam huwa al-hal, Islam is the solution. Okay, which Islam?
Yeah.
Once you start getting them down to the nitty-gritty details, that's when they get into a crisis, because they can't come up with a single position that will satisfy all of those classes. During the revolution, and during this year of Morsi's presidency, people were making fun of Morsi as a weak president who would, in the morning, he would take some position or issue some decree only to scrap it at night. Most significantly, for example, austerity measures. But this wasn't about him being weak. It was about him responding to his base. This is why when they were put in power finally after 7 decades of persecution, they could not take a concrete stand that will satisfy all members of their movement. So they would then opt for like cultural wars. They would opt for vague, kind of slogans, helped by the fact that the opposition at the time, which is Jabhat al-Inqaz or the Salvation Front, they adopted this secular Islamist divide. And once you get into secular versus Islamist politics, actually the leaders of each camp can well control their base cadres, because it's not about austerity measures, it's not about working class politics, it's not about social reforms, it's about protecting our culture, protecting our identity, protecting this, protecting that. And in so many ways, that's what allowed the military to play on these differences and hijack the scene and launch their military coup in 2013.
Yeah, you also mentioned that by the time that the revolution came around, that the Muslim Brotherhood no longer aspired to like a global caliphate. It was more focused on just like nation state building. But like, how did that change its inner working? I guess, are you saying that it kind of focused more, like that's the focusing more on the cultural issues is a byproduct of that, or did it also change other ways?
I think the Brotherhood was always pretty willing to be a political player, right? or I mean, I know they weren't able to be in power, but didn't they kind of always have this kind of idea that they would like to be a party?
They, the Muslim Brotherhood, since it's massive and it's big,
Right.
there are different wings and different factions within it. And there is a historical tension between two factions. One that wants to push the organization into just da'wah or preaching activities to act as some religious society, while the other wing would push for behaving like a political party, like, the Christian Democrats here in Germany, for example, of having a political party that contests election, that comes up with political programs, that would run for parliamentary seats, local council seats, and what have you. Mainly, and to be much more open when it comes to organizing and collaborating with other non-Islamist forces. So historically, there is always this tension between the two. And of course, here I'm oversimplifying things. I mean, there are actually much more factions than that. But if we can, like for the sake of simplicity, we can narrow them down to these two camps. This is also helped by the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood, in the 10 years in the run-up to the revolution, they have developed political cadres that took part in elections, that they got so much training in political battles in order to get elected to a parliament, to run constituencies. And they thought that they would be qualified enough in order to take on the administration of the country. And in so many ways, they could have gotten away with it. And Morsi could have completed his term if they succeeded in the goal that was the main central pillar of this Faustian bargain between them and the military, which is end the revolution, diffuse the militancy in the streets, which they couldn't do. That's why, the military coup happened.
Right. And I guess there's a whole other world, which is not a real one, but if we're thinking about what could have gone differently, in which they actually adopted the revolution instead of just taking on the position of the state and kind of then taking on the position of seeing the revolutionaries as adversaries, including, it sounds like, some of the younger members of their own party.
Yeah.
Yeah, in every single clash with the military before the coup, whether it's the Muhammad Mahmoud uprising in November 2011, or the Occupy cabinet clashes in December 2011, or in the other mobilizations in Tahrir and elsewhere, I mean, I saw with my own eyes young Muslim Brotherhood members who were there in defiance of their leadership positions. Now, if you talk to other people in the secular opposition, like the liberals, they would tell you, "Oh, this is just part of division of labor. They would send in their kids there just in case." No, it's not. No, it's not at all. These guys were there in defiance of their leadership. And I'll tell you also another ironic observation that I witnessed personally during Morsi's presidency. I come from the Revolutionary Socialists. I'm part of the Revolutionary Socialists, and we were heavily involved in the industrial actions and the labor strikes, whether before or during or after the revolution. And part of what we were doing was to provide legal aid for victimized strikers. During that year of Morsi's presidency, some of the victimized strikers that we were in touch with and that we helped out were Muslim Brotherhood members. So you had their leader was literally the president of the country, leading the country, while their base cadres are getting crushed by that state. So this is not some conspiracy, as the liberals would tell you. No, it tells you something deeper, that we are we are confronting a political tendency that's multi-class, that is always vacillating between confrontation and compromise. And this has got to all the things to do with their class nature at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Whether they like it or not, they will continue this kind of fractured politics.
This is what I really appreciate about the book, is that it doesn't take for granted, that people's allegiances solely based on the group with which they're affiliated. And you also, I think you mentioned at some point, like Sisi was vaunted to the place where he was kind of well positioned for the coup by Morsi, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And you're saying that like while he was like head of, was it military intelligence, had actually met with representatives of the revolutionary youth movement, who we talked about with Rasha Latif, and she has the book about Tahrir's youth. But he tried to turn them against the Muslim Brotherhood at that time. Was that kind of portending, or kind of signaling that his interest in perhaps coupping, or is that just kind of they both had turned against the Islamists at that point?
I don't think so. This doesn't tell you that from the start he wanted to coup the Brotherhood, but the Egyptian military for decades, it was considered the last bastion for the defense of the state against an Islamist takeover. And the military does have its own corporate interests. And, Ahmed, I mean, I remember those days in 2011, 2012, when the honeymoon between the military and the Islamists was still there. And people, including analysts, were making all sorts of theories and conspiracy theories and analyses about like how the Islamists were embedded in the military, how Sisi was a Muslim Brotherhood in the closet, how the Muslim Brotherhood for decades have been building roots inside the military, and the military's ideology is actually Islamist leaning. No, it's bullshit. The military's ideology is the military's. the military that we own the state, we own Egypt. The civilians, they can have their own circus, but it's us at the end of the day who set the limits and set the red lines for what's permissible, what's not. We have our corporate interests. We are not just a state within a state. We are the state at the end of the day. And when Sisi met with the youth leaders after Mubarak's fall, and I go through details of that meeting, he did try to incite them against the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, but it was part of the divide and rule that the military was doing. And I think that the military at that time, they were still testing the waters. I mean, I met later, people who would tell you that the military did not know who to invite to their meetings in order to discuss the transition. So they would basically look at TV and look who's appearing on TV, and then deduct right away, well, if he's appearing on TV, he must be influential. They were not really well-versed at the time in who's running things, who's part of what organization, because they had left all of this shit basically to the police. It's the police who, who take care of these things, while we have the state at the end of the day. So Sisi's statements in that meeting that you alluded to basically reflects that. It's not about him wanting to coup the Brotherhood from day one, as the Muslim Brotherhood today might say. But it was actually still testing waters and who's who and who's doing what.
I'm really interested in kind of understanding better the role of the Muslim Brotherhood. And one thing I got out of your book that has really helped me, because I don't have a lot of context, I read a little bit of like Carrie Wickman's book, which you quote at one point, though I need to, this is making me want make sure I finish it, is that there is this kind of like class-based distinction that's not being talked about, because the Muslim Brotherhood is often kind of seen as a sort of boogeyman in the West. But I'm interested in like you capture this kind of focus on surveillance of mosques and religious people, and kind of really leading up to, I mean, through all the presidents that we've talked about, leading up to Morsi being put into power. And I'm wondering, is that just kind of a class-based distinction? Is that fear of the brotherhood? Is that just are people who fear of people who happen to be more working class? Like, why specifically were mosques being surveilled? And also, if you could say a little bit about, I was super interested in the way that the war on terror was utilized as a kind of excuse in Egypt to terrorize everyday people, that was really kind of picked up on.
Mosques are surveilled in Egypt because the government was adopting an old British colonial tactic, which is dry up the swamp, تكفيف المنابع. If the jihadis, they come from Islamist backgrounds, then surveil the sources. And these are the mosques. Anyone who is bearded in the streets. I mean, we talk in the West about discrimination against Muslims and how people women in niqab or, bearded men in traditional dresses are kind of like targeted. But, that's what the Egyptian police was doing
Yeah.
in Egypt in the 1990s. And all the way up until the revolution. For example, whenever I traveled anywhere, like if I wanted to go on vacation, whether it's in Sinai or in the south of the Red Sea, I always made sure to shave because if I get stopped by a police checkpoint and I'm bearded, they will scrutinize me more than if I was not. So talk of profiling here at the end of the day. But going back to Yasmin's remark, why they fear the mosques, it's again, it's about drying up the sources of dissent. In Egypt, historically, we didn't really have much places where people could assemble and talk and discuss and organize. And maybe that will shock, the audience in the West, but the mosques were not just a playground for Islamist parties. The communists in Al-Ma'asara and Hilwan, they used to organize inside the mosques. Most of our protests, I'm talking about us as leftists, would take place on Fridays after the Friday sermons. Because where else would you find thousands of people in the same place at the same time in these areas? So the mosques were always subject to scrutiny, to surveillance, to being besieged at the end of the day. And again, it's not a coincidence that the Friday of Rage, which was the turning point in the revolution, happened on Friday after mosques. And without mentioning names, because I don't want to get him into trouble, like I knew personally a Coptic comrade who used to go to Al-Azhar on Fridays during the war on Iraq and pretend that he's praying, with the rest of the Muslims, only to be led, in the protest, so as to
Aww.
be able to lead the protest after it's over.
Yeah.
And they would, the Muslim worshippers would be carrying, him on the shoulders while he's, leading the chants.
Yeah.
So their fear of the mosques comes from this. Their fear of the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in the West, I think part of it is racism. It's Islamophobia. It's an age-old stereotypes of what Muslims and brown people can do or cannot do. But having said that, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Americans, they collaborated and worked well during the Afghan jihad against the Soviets.
Completely.
The Muslim Brotherhood were the ones who were running the international aid and relief efforts to the Afghanis. They helped with the recruitment of the Mujahideen, and this was all done with the blessing of the Americans. The Americans, at the end of the day, whether they are in a cultural war or not, money speaks at the end of the day. Many of their allies around the world, they are, Muslims, including like Islamic states. Yasmin, you're half Pakistani, as far as I understand, right?
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
the Pakistani state and the Americans. I mean, look at them. My God.
I really want to do an episode, actually. Pakistan having a field day playing double agent right now.
Exactly. There's a lot to say, to be said,
There is.
about this. But yeah, I hope this answered your question.
That's super
yeah.
helpful. Thank you.
I think the language of also the war on terror and the framing of that, I think, like both of you alluded to earlier, is really what kind of gave it a mandate to like really expand its targeting to citizens, regardless of whatever political group they were associated with. Is just, anyone who looked a certain way could just, like you said, be snatched up or questioned or whatever. But this is also the time when like torture became standard protocol. Can you talk a little bit about the implementation of torture in the regime, and also talk about that alongside, the fact that over the decades, this massive security state just kind of became very bloated, and much like in the US, right? Like we have this massive military. There really aren't that many problems in the world that we should be involved with. And now that we're having to invent all these reasons to go to war abroad, and that's becoming more and more unpopular, you see that military apparatus being turned in on its own people. So can you kind of just like talk about those dynamics developing in Egypt over the decades leading up to the revolution and post-revolution?
Sure. Egypt is always notorious for torture. I mean, at least in the security literature in the West. It's not also a coincidence that Egypt, we were a main player in the extraordinary renditions program by the CIA, where suspects were sent to Egypt in order to get tortured and interrogated. I mean, I myself am a victim of torture. I was tortured in October 2000 at the hands of state security police at the time, which also played a role in me being interested in this, not just for political and research purposes, but it's also for very personal reasons.
So that's amazing. You didn't come out of the torture and say, okay, I think I maybe should stop being involved. You came out and said, I'm going to figure these motherfuckers out.
Exactly. I'm going to have, I'm going to have the last laugh.
Yeah.
So under Nasser, I mean, usually when people talk about the Nasser regime, it's the military dictatorship, people who repressed and what have you. But torture under Nasser was kind of reserved for dissidents. I'm not saying this is a positive thing, but you compare that to the police under Mubarak, where everyone was getting tortured. Everyone. This is the daily interaction of the police.
It's almost like an instrument of control, right? More than trying to find intelligence. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, this is not just about like them interrogating X in order to extract confession. No, I mean, torture was being used on a massive scale for any trivial reason that you can imagine. One of the late human rights lawyers, he's the father of Ala Abdel Fattah, the famous Egyptian dissident. He, in an interview with him in 2002, it was in 2002. He told me that right now torture is being privatized, that we have the privatization of torture. Torture is not only used in order to extract confession or to fight, terrorism or what have you, but in a fight between neighbors, if a neighbor knows a policeman, he can enlist his help in order to torture his neighbor. Things were happening that were really surreal. I mean, you could go to a police station in order to report your missing daughter, but then you never come out of the police station because they will arrest you and torture you and accuse you that you're actually the one who kidnapped your daughter and killed her, and now you're pretending, for example, that she's dead. You could go to report your missing laptop only to get arrested that actually you must have stolen this laptop. The police, just like any bureaucracy machine, they had targets. For example, when we were, during our youth, it was known that it's better not to go and score hashish or weed in November or December in Egypt, because that's the end of the year, and the police usually has a target of like drug cases that they have to achieve. So there will be like massive crackdown of any kind of on drugs. So try to avoid drugs at least, these 2 months. So in that regards, as Yasmin was saying earlier, police is a tool of social control. Police is not there in order to fight crime. That's what they tell us. That's how they market themselves. But it's a tool of social control. Under Nasser, the regime had so much legitimacy, at least up until 1967, that the police was not needed in order to exert social control. And actually, social control was outsourced to many civilian institutions, whether it's the Arab Socialist Union, which was the one party of the regime, the Organization of the Socialist Youth, which was its youth arms, the state-backed General Federation of Trade Unions, which was created in 1957 in order to police the workplaces. There were tons of institutions. So the police didn't need, really, to torture anyone. When did torture start? Or like, when did torture start becoming an epidemic that would target not just political dissidents, but also the average Egyptian? This was under Sadat in the late 1970s. And again, it's not a coincidence, because Sadat started dismantling the Nasserist state and its institutions. Those same institutions were staffed with bureaucrats that Sadat regarded as his adversaries. And also part of the shift to market capitalism, he wanted to get rid of those institutions. But it is those institutions that helped to stabilize society, to control society, to police society. So when those institutions started to fracture, the police had to fill in the gap. And how would the police fill in the gap? Not by distributing flowers, not by electric shocks, by whips, by beating the living shit out of everybody.
Right. Not by providing social services. Yeah.
Oh, God forbid, no. But and then things went completely out of control under Mubarak.
Yeah. So I think that's useful to know, that the use of torture being normalized coincided with the rise of neoliberalization of Egypt's economy, and just kind of like the removal of social services that helped your everyday person. And social mobility just kind of not only stagnated, but declined and became really hard for your average everyday Egyptian. But then you talk about how, being part of the security state, at some point, we need to remove as many of the class antagonisms there as possible. And that became the way that a lot of Egyptians achieved social mobility, upward social mobility, rather. And so can you kind of maybe talk a bit about how people ascended the ranks, who did well in the security state, who didn't do well, how was dissent, approached within the military apparatus?
You first, you made a spot on point, because this would also be relevant to the US and honestly anywhere else in the world. Neoliberalism and wars on terror, on crime, on drugs, on what have you, they usually go hand in hand. On the one hand, the state implements austerity, withdraws from the social sphere, cuts down social services, and if any resistance or any backlash happens in society, then the militarized police forces can intervene in the name of fighting terror, in the name of fighting crime, in the name of fighting drugs. So they always go hand in hand. So it's not, again, a coincidence that our first war on terror in Egypt started in 1991, 1992, which was the same year that Hosni Mubarak started the AirSAP program, which was, it's an acronym, the Economic Reform and Structural Adjustment Program, which was our neoliberal transition under the sponsorship of the IMF and the World Bank. The war on terror was declared in the same year. And although the declared target was the Islamic Jihad and the Jama'ah Islamiyya, the crackdown soon reached the professional syndicates. Our professional syndicates were nationalized by the government. These syndicates, I mean here the doctor syndicate, the pharmacist syndicate, the lawyer syndicate, the journal syndicate. These were all places that enjoyed relative autonomy compared to the blue-collar unions in Egypt. The crackdown soon reached the Muslim Brotherhood, which was reformist, and they were not involved in armed operations of any kind at the time. The crackdown, I mean, they went on to the left, to everybody. My first arrest and torture was in the year October 2000. And I was detained in the name of the war on terror in Egypt. And actually, I was locked up in an underground cell at the State Security Police Headquarters with Islamic Jihadi suspects at the time. So these kind of wars, they go hand in hand with austerity, with neoliberalism. Because at the end of the day, it is the perfect excuse, basically, to control society. And one thing I didn't mention in the book, but it's kind of like an irony. The place where I was detained and tortured in October 2000 will now become a Marriott hotel.
Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah. But I guess I will mention that in the second edition, inshallah.
Is that, I gotta ask, and we can cut this out if you want, but is that something that you've spoken about publicly in detail, or is that, you know, something that you prefer to not speak about?
You mean my torture experience?
Yeah, I guess the circumstances of like you being detained and then the torture experience.
No, I mean, I did speak about it, and I don't find any problems in talking about it. And
because I was curious, I was curious while I was reading this. You know, it's not super discussed in detail in the book, but I was wondering like what you specifically observed while you were there. And I guess also curious about what the initial charges were, or like the circumstances of you being abducted, I assume.
The second Palestinian Intifada had broken out on the 28th of September 2000. And at the time, I was a master's student at the American University in Cairo, which at the time was located in downtown Cairo, facing Tahrir Square. And I had already been in the Egyptian Revolutionary Socialists for 2 years, and have been active in organizing protests on the campus. I had already received threats from state security police before that, but things for them basically had crossed the red lines, because not only did I manage to, together with my comrades, to mobilize actually strong protests, but I climbed the roof of the university and took down the American flag, which was on top of the building facing Tahrir.
And that's one of the greatest crimes you can commit in Egypt.
In Egypt.
Exactly. And actually, since then, it never went up again. So I guess that's like my biggest achievement.
Yeah.
And me and my comrades, we were trying to steer the protest into criticism of the local conditions. Meaning, yeah, I mean, we were denouncing Israel, we were denouncing the US. But at the same time, we raised the slogan that the road to Jerusalem passes through Cairo. And if we want to liberate Jerusalem, first we have to liberate Cairo. And we were always talking about Hosni Mubarak and his complicity in the crimes against the Palestinians. And this touched a nerve, definitely, with the police. Remember, we're talking here the year 2000, so Mubarak was still a huge taboo. This is well before the Kifaya years and the relative political opening, which happened later. So one night, this was on the 8th of October, I was driving my car heading to Giza, where I was supposed to meet Ahmed Fuad Nigm, who is this famous Egyptian poet. He passed away a few years ago. And he has a legendary status because most of the historical left-wing protest poems and songs were written by him. And Nigm had heard of me and he knew of my role in the protests, so he wanted to meet me. So I was heading to Giza in order to have dinner with him and another common friend who actually lived in Giza. Just like in the movies, on my way, like two cars, I noticed I was being tailed. And then two cars out of the blue showed up and they cut the road in front of me. And then I found armed personnel who were dressed in civilian clothes. They came out of these two cars and they kidnapped me, blindfolded me with the Palestinian scarf I was wearing. And then they took me to, I mean, of course, I knew that later because I was blindfolded at the time. They took me to Lazogli Square. This is in downtown Cairo. It's the massive security compound that hosts both the Interior Ministry and the State Security Police headquarters at the time. And for 4 days, I went through an odyssey of, torture. They stripped me naked. I was blindfolded most of the time. My hands were tied behind my back. They kept on beating me, verbally insulting me, threatening to rape me and my family. Then they would play psychological tricks, with the good cop and the bad cop. Like one would beat the living shit out of me in a room. And then they would dress me up and take me to the other room where someone would say, no, 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 no. Why are you hitting him? You shouldn't have hit him. I told you not to hit him. Sit down, Hussam. Do you want to have some water? Blah, blah. Hussam, your dad has just passed away. Your mom is alone. Do you want to bring troubles to your family? This kind of shit.
Yeah. When you were experiencing it in the moment, I mean, were the tactics effective or compelling, or were you thinking like, oh, these guys are idiots?
In a way, I was lucky because before my arrest, I mean, when I joined the organization, part of the kind of political education we used to receive as young recruits were what to do when you get arrested. And it's not like dramatic Mission Impossible, Jack Bauer, style of like, simulating torture and,
right.
locking us up in some room to beat the shit out of us. But no, a veteran comrade told us, and really, I mean, his advice is the one that like made me like hold out. He said that when you are in detention, the only information you know is your name and what's written on the ID card, like your home address. Anything else you don't know. If they ask you anything, you just say, I will not speak except in front of the prosecutor and in the presence of a lawyer. They will beat the shit out of you. But actually, the 10th hit would be um, how do I say it in English? You will not feel the 10th hit as much as you would feel the first one. And if they shock you with electricity, the 10th time they shock you will not be like the first one. And actually, the more you speak, the more you will get tortured.
Because there's
So-
always more information, I guess.
Exactly. I mean, you're signaling to them that, oh, we slapped Hossam, so now he's speaking. So if we slap him 10 times, he will speak more. Then let's electrocute him. He will speak even more. Then let's do this, let's do that. This veteran comrade told us, like, you hold out, you hold your tongue, you only say that I will not speak except in front of the prosecutor and in the presence of a lawyer. They will insult you, they will beat the living shit out of you, but then this will save you. This will save you even more severe torture on the one hand. Secondly, and more importantly, and this was a kind of motivation actually for me so as not to talk while I was tortured, is that if you start talking, they will turn you into an informer. Meaning, if they arrested Hossam and he spoke, this means that whenever any shit happens at the American University in Cairo, get us Hossam, the one who spoke last time, because he will tell us what happened.
And I think you
So he
even
said-
say that some of your family members were coerced into becoming informants.
Exactly. I had two Salafi cousins. So my motivation to hold out was so many things, but among them is that this ordeal will never end in the future if I start speaking.
This also just speaks to the ineffectiveness, in addition to obviously the huge immorality and the terribleness of this, it's just also not very effective. Like, of course, people lie under torture.
Yeah.
And then, like, if you know ahead of time, because they've established this pattern that if you speak, you're going to have more physical pain. Just none of it is effective. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. did the same things in Iraq, and there was just like that big report that says like actually everything that we extracted under what was the euphemism for torture? Enhanced interrogation.
Enhanced interrogation.
Right. Like everything that we got from that is useless. Like none of it was useful at all.
Exactly, but you also have to put in another thing in consideration, and this goes back to your earlier question, Ahmed, that I kind of like missed answering about the torturers themselves or about the officers themselves. While they are inside this institution, their promotions, their bonuses, their social mobility is tied up to how many cases they quote unquote solve, how many terrorists they have neutralized, how many dissidents have they contained. So there were those alleged jihadis that I was detained with, most of them had nothing to do with the jihad, had nothing to do with the radicals. But the counter extremism officer, this is the administration that ran the war on terror, they had to present on paper that the war on terror is progressing. We are protecting the state. We are fighting the terrorists. And in the same way that McNamara in Vietnam depended on body count, the similar logic also rules when it came to the Egyptian officers. So they were torturing people to get confessions because they needed, as we say in Egypt, to complete the papers. تكمل الورق, تستف الورق, to organize your papers. You had to present a case, at the end of this year that, you got 120 terrorists.
Was this time under like I think you mentioned Habib al-Adli is one of the like people he kind of made his career on demonizing Palestinian groups.
Uh, he didn't make his career out of necessarily demonizing, but there was an episode when we had the bombing of the Knesset al-Qaddisin, a church, in January 2011, whose perpetrators, by the way, up until today, are not known, and they haven't been submitted
Oh,
to.
interesting. Are there any
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
like theories around who might have, whether it was like a,
there are so many conspiracy theories, but
yeah.
it could be
Either way,
freelance
they
jihadis.
capitalized on the opportunity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Habib al-Adli, when he couldn't come up with the perpetrator, he blamed Jaish al-Islam in Gaza. So in a way, like, he demonized the Palestinians this way, but the demonization of the Palestinians, that honestly, I mean, it needs a whole episode where we can talk about, because
for
it
sure.
was a cornerstone of the regime's propaganda since Sadat's time, in order to cement the alliance with the US and Israel.
Yeah.
I have a kind of larger macro question. So you mentioned like Pakistan earlier, and throughout reading this book, I was just like, this is so interesting because I think that this is the story of so many post-colonial states, right? There has not been a single leader in Pakistan who has had a term that has not ended in a coup or assassination. There's been no one since like 1948 who has had like a peaceful transition of power. And this also kind of reminded me of some of our conversation with Rusha Latif about like, just like this idea of militaries with states and this kind of idea of a larger international context and world order. I mean, even the war on terror being exported to Egypt and then being used to like ironically terrorize citizens. This might be too macro of a question, but I'm wondering if we need to think, and I know that you're a socialist, and do we need to think more in terms of like revolution outside of the structure of the nation state? I mean, even here in the US, we're getting to a point, and perhaps this was true far before I realized it, where it feels like all we have that is functioning is our military, right? Our military is working and it's doing awful things around the globe. And we have certainly an increasingly strong police state. We're getting to the point that now we have clashes between our different police, between, local police and between ICE. And it is not inconceivable that the military proper will be turned further inward. So in that kind of like structure, it's like how much would a revolution in the US do for us, right? Like, is the structure of the nation state, sorry, this is probably way too big of a question, but like, is the structure of the nation state just fundamentally flawed? I guess you start within that structure because where else will you start? But
I want to add on to that actually. So the military in the US, and I think you also say similar of like Egypt's security state, it is doing, and it is very effective at repressing its own people. But like we're seeing in Iran, like it's just lost the capability to actually decidedly like win a war. You know what I'm saying?
that's also true.
The
It's
same
not
way
even that effective at its awful goals.
So it's just like you have all this like military bloat, and you're just like, for what?
That has been living under embargo and
Yeah.
Making like $35,000 drones to take out $4 million
that's
pieces
true.
of equipment. It's just an insane, but yeah, very
But
effective.
it is economically effective in that just like weapons manufacturers keep
absolutely.
on producing and they keep on
Sucks
feeding
up
this
money
machine.
from poor people.
Yeah, but like, for a country like Pakistan where it really like is a state, it's a military that has a state and not the other way around. It's like, is that even? I don't know. Could that even be redeemed through the nation state? Does that make sense? I don't know.
No, I don't believe so. Definitely, I will fight for reforms. Any step, any inch, any public space that we can liberate from state repression. I would definitely be part of this fight. I will always be for reforming whatever laws that exist. If workers strike over increasing their wages, which at the end of the day, it's only improving their conditions of slavery, I will be part of these fights, and I've already been part of these fights. But my end goal is something more ambitious, is something much more crazy for the average person, which is a complete overhaul of the global system, not just in Egypt. I believe that another world is possible, as the slogan goes. And I'm always guided by what my late father used to tell me all the time when I was a kid or a teenager, whenever we discussed Egypt or politics, because I grew up in a highly politicized family, mainly thanks to my dad. He always used to say, we deserve better. We deserve better. احنا نستاهل أحسن من كده. We deserve better. And I'm always guided by this sentence. The solution to our problems will not be confined or cannot be delivered within the nation state. And if the experience of the Egyptian revolution tells us anything, it should confirm such an argument. The state could not be reformed even during a revolution. The state could not be used in order to achieve democracy and very humble, actually, kind of demands related to just stopping torture, just giving a fair wage, allowing freedom of assembly, giving full employment to the economy. These were all like mild demands that were raised by the different dissident groups during the revolution. But the state could not be reformed. The state basically came back with vengeance. And in its coming back, it came back supported by a regional and a global system that saw the Egyptian revolution as a threat. The UAE and Saudi Arabia played a central role in the coup and in financing it. The US and the Europeans, they played a central role in propping up the Sisi regime. Sisi could not have stayed in power for a decade if it wasn't for the bailouts from the Europeans, more specifically. Everyone wants, quote unquote, stability at any price. And if that stability will be brought by a fanatic general who kills 1,000 people in broad daylight in a massacre that's aired live on TV, so let it be at the end of the day. But in my struggle, in order to bring about change in Egypt, all the time I am looking to other allies outside Egypt. And these allies are not in the White House. They are not in 10 Downing Street. They are not in the courts of power, but it would be people like you, people who are student activists, people who are human rights activists, people in the trade unions. In the same way that Tahrir, when we toppled Mubarak in 2011, you had people in the US raising the slogan American Tahrir in some of the strikes that took place. You had the Occupy movement drawing parallels with what happened in Egypt. It is because at the end of the day, even when we get into petty fights related to ethnicity and related to nationalism and related to religious sects, we know at the end of the day that we are part of the same camp. And any victory for us anywhere is a victory for the rest, in the same way that defeats also spread by the domino effect. Is it a coincidence that the monstrosity in Syria escalated on a very unprecedented scale, except after the Rab'a massacre in Egypt? If you look at the repression that happened in the region, the Rab'a massacre was more or less a trigger, in the same way that the Egyptian revolution in 2011 was also a trigger. So in that sense, when people come to me, whether here in Germany or anywhere else, whenever I give public talks and they tell me, how can we help Egyptians? I tell them, of course, you can help by protesting in front of the Egyptian embassy, you can do this, you can do that, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, the biggest thing you can do to help us is to get active locally. It's all the same matrix, it's all the same system. And if we manage to weaken that system anywhere or achieve victory over that system anywhere, it resonates by the domino effect.
Yeah.
So if you are in some US state and you win a fight over garbage collection, if you win a fight over taxes, if you win a fight over trade union rights, somewhere in the US, you are actually helping Egyptian dissidents. I know that the liaison might not be that explicit and that clear for the average person, but it is our job as activists to highlight such connections, because these connections are not artificial, and there are so many historical precedents for it. I will just conclude, by a story. I mean, I always find it fascinating. Like when the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917, by the domino effect, it spread to Italy, Finland, Germany, and other places. You cannot isolate also the Egyptian revolution in 1919 against the Brits from that wave. And actually, sometimes the best source of information about some country in the global south could come from the colonial archives of the colonizer. And actually, the police reports at the time in Egypt, that was discussing what we call now sentiment analysis, was talking about that Egyptians in the local ahwas, in the local coffee shops, are saying there are great things happening in Russia now, and that the Bolsheviks are good Muslims and they will come to liberate us.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, part of it is because anyone who's good must be a Muslim, but also the other part had to do with the fact that initially, during the Russian Revolution, actually the Muslim minorities, they were liberated. They were given the right to self-determination in the beginning, at least. So it's whenever you feel that someone who is just in such a shitty situation as you, and who looks like you, but has started to do something about it and it worked, that's how you get inspired. So my message actually to anyone who's listening to this is to get active locally if you want to help Egypt.
Yeah.
That's such a beautiful sentiment. I just want to say really quickly, I find that so helpful in a time where things are feeling so like static here in the US. And it's such a good reminder. We've been so trained, if you have any kind of leftist background, to see like intersection in oppressive forces. But I feel like we're less trained to see like optimistic intersections. You know what I mean? Like we're less trained to think about like, oh, if we make progress here, or if anyone makes progress anywhere, that could show a light for us. So that's really helpful.
And I'm sorry I started out the episode by making fun of the 1,000 people who broke those dogs out of prison.
I think that was before we were recording.
Little did I know that they were getting us one step closer to global revolution.
See,
just next time, maybe people instead of dogs.
But
that's my only plea.
That was a start.
But
Inshallah.
Inshallah. I think that's a great place to end it. I just want to say again, the book unravels just like so many things, and I think it is a sign not only of a great mind to be able to understand all these things, but also just dogged determinism and a commitment to higher principles and an ultimate liberation of everyone around the world. And so I think that is very, very clear. It's much like when you see in a movie and there's a detective looking like at a board with like string connecting all these things, and you're like, how is it possibly connected? You in your book you've connected everything perfectly. I think it's super relevant to the moment. It lays out a framework for understanding the thing that you are up against, whether you are in Egypt or in the US or in Germany or wherever. And so thank you so much for producing it. And Hossam el-Hamalawy, thank you so much for coming back and having this conversation with us.
Thanks, Ahmed. Thanks, Yasmin. And again, it's really truly an honor. I'm not exaggerating. It's truly an honor to be on your podcast and to have such a positive feedback from people like you, whom I admire and respect a lot. It really means a lot to me. And I hope that your readers and your followers would find the book informative. And I look forward to be on your show sometime again soon, inshallah.
always. Okay. طيب شكرا جزيلا.
مع السلامة.
مع
حبيبي.
السلامة.
مع السلامة.